Brazil, officially the Federative Republic of Brazil, is the largest and easternmost country in South America and in Latin America. Brazil is the world's fifth largest country by area and the seventh most populous. Its capital is Brasilia, and its most populous city is São Paulo. The federation is composed of the union of the 26 states and the federal district. It is the only country in the Americas to have Portuguese as an official language. Brazil is one of the most multicultural and ethnically diverse nations, due to over a century of mass immigration from around the world. Bounded by the Atlantic Ocean on the east, Brazil has a coastline of 7,491 kilometers. It borders all other countries and territories in South America except Ecuador and Chile and covers roughly half of the continent's land area. Its Amazon basin includes a vast tropical forest, home to diverse wildlife, a variety of ecological systems, and extensive natural resources spanning numerous protected habitats. This unique environmental heritage positions Brazil at number 1 of 17 megadiverse countries, and is the subject of significant global interest, as environmental degradation through processes like deforestation has direct impacts on global issues like climate change and biodiversity loss. The territory, which would become known as Brazil, was inhabited by numerous tribal nations prior to the landing in 1500 of explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral, who claimed the discovered land for the Portuguese Empire. Brazil remained a Portuguese colony until 1808, when the capital of the empire was transferred from Lisbon to Rio de Janeiro. In 1815, the colony was elevated to the rank of kingdom upon the formation of the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. Independence was achieved in 1822 with the creation of the Empire of Brazil, a unitary state governed under a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary system. The ratification of the first constitution in 1824 led to the formation of a bicameral legislature, now called the National Congress. Slavery was abolished in 1888. The country became a presidential republic in 1889 following a military coup d'état. An authoritarian military dictatorship emerged in 1964 and ruled until 1985, after which civilian governance resumed. Brazil's current constitution, formulated in 1988, defines it as a democratic federal republic. Due to its rich culture and history, the country ranks 13th in the world by number of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Brazil is a regional and middle power that is an emerging power and a major non-NATO ally of the United States. Categorized as a developing country with a high Human Development Index, Brazil is considered an advanced emerging economy, having the 9th largest GDP in the world by nominal, and 8th by PPP measures, the largest in Latin America. As an upper-middle income economy by the World Bank and a newly industrialized country, Brazil has the largest share of global wealth in South America and is one of the world's major bread baskets, being the largest producer of coffee for the last 150 years. However, the country retains noticeable corruption, crime, and social inequality. Brazil is a founding member of the United Nations, the G20, BRICS, G4, Mercosul, Organization of American States, Organization of Ibero-American States, and the Community of Portuguese Language Countries. Brazil is also an observer state of the Arab League. History. Pre-Cabraline era. Some of the earliest human remains found in the Americas, Luzia woman, were found in the area of Pedro Leopoldo, Minas Gerais, and provide evidence of human habitation going back at least 11,000 years. The earliest pottery ever found in the Western Hemisphere was excavated in the Amazon basin of Brazil and radiocarbon dated to 8,000 years ago. The pottery was found near Santarém and provides evidence that the region supported a complex prehistoric culture. The Marajora culture flourished on Marajo in the Amazon Delta, developing sophisticated pottery, social stratification, large populations, mound building, and complex social formations such as chiefdoms. Around the time of the Portuguese arrival, the territory of current-day Brazil had an estimated indigenous population of 7 million people, mostly semi-nomadic, who subsisted on hunting, fishing, gathering, and migrant agriculture. The population comprised several large indigenous ethnic groups. The Tupi people were subdivided into the Tupinicans and Tupinambas. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the boundaries between these groups and their subgroups were marked by wars that arose from differences in culture, language, and moral beliefs. These wars also involved large-scale military actions on land and water, with cannibalistic rituals on prisoners of war. While heredity had some weight, leadership was a status more won over time than assigned in succession ceremonies and conventions. Slavery among the indigenous groups had a different meaning than it had for Europeans, since it originated from a diverse socio-economic organization, in which asymmetries were translated into kinship relations. Portuguese colonization. Following the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, the land now called Brazil was claimed for the Portuguese Empire on April 22, 1500, with the arrival of the Portuguese fleet commanded by Pedro Álvares Cabral. The Portuguese encountered indigenous peoples divided into several ethnic societies, most of whom spoke languages of the Tupi, Guarani family and fought among themselves. Though the first settlement was founded in 1532, colonization effectively began in 1534, when King John III of Portugal divided the territory into the 15 private and autonomous captaincies. However, the decentralized and unorganized tendencies of the captaincies proved problematic, and in 1549 the Portuguese king restructured them into the Governorate General of Brazil in the city of Salvador, which became the capital of a single and centralized Portuguese colony in South America. In the first 2 centuries of colonization, indigenous and European groups lived in constant war, establishing opportunistic alliances in order to gain advantages against each other. By the mid-16th century, cane sugar had become Brazil's most important export, while slaves purchased in sub-Saharan Africa in the slave market of Western Africa, not only those from Portuguese allies of their colonies in Angola and Mozambique, had become its largest import, to cope with sugarcane plantations, due to increasing international demand for Brazilian sugar. Brazil received more than 2.8 million slaves from Africa between the years 1500 and 1800. By the end of the 17th century, sugarcane exports began to decline, and the discovery of gold by Bandeirantes in the 1690s would become the new backbone of the colony's economy, fostering a gold rush which attracted thousands of new settlers to Brazil from Portugal and all Portuguese colonies around the world. This increased level of immigration in turn caused some conflicts between newcomers and old settlers. Portuguese expeditions known as Bandeiras gradually expanded Brazil's original colonial frontiers in South America to its approximately current borders. In this era other European powers tried to colonize parts of Brazil, in incursions that the Portuguese had to fight, notably the French in Rio during the 1560s, in Maranhão during the 1610s, and the Dutch in Bahia and Pernambuco, during the Dutch-Portuguese War, after the end of Iberian Union. The Portuguese colonial administration in Brazil had 2 objectives that would ensure colonial order and the monopoly of Portugal's wealthiest and largest colony: to keep under control and eradicate all forms of slave rebellion and resistance, such as the Quilombo of Palmares, and to repress all movements for autonomy or independence, such as the Minas Gerais conspiracy. Elevation to kingdom. In late 1807, Spanish and Napoleonic forces threatened the security of continental Portugal, causing Prince Regent John, in the name of Queen Maria I, to move the royal court from Lisbon to Rio de Janeiro. There they established some of Brazil's first financial institutions, such as its local stock exchanges and its national bank, additionally ending the Portuguese monopoly on Brazilian trade and opening Brazil's ports to other nations. In 1809, in retaliation for being forced into exile, the Prince Regent ordered the conquest of French Guiana. With the end of the Peninsular War in 1814, the courts of Europe demanded that Queen Maria I and Prince Regent John return to Portugal, deeming it unfit for the head of an ancient European monarchy to reside in a colony. In 1815, to justify continuing to live in Brazil, where the royal court had thrived for 6 years, the Crown established the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, thus creating a pluricontinental transatlantic monarchic state. However, the leadership in Portugal, resentful of the new status of its larger colony, continued to demand the return of the court to Lisbon. In 1821, acceding to the demands of revolutionaries who had taken the city of Porto, John VI departed for Lisbon. There he swore an oath to the new constitution, leaving his son, Prince Pedro de Alcantara, as regent of the Kingdom of Brazil. Independent Empire. Tensions between Portuguese and Brazilians increased, and the Portuguese Cortes, guided by the new political regime imposed by the Liberal Revolution, tried to re-establish Brazil as a colony. The Brazilians refused to yield, and Prince Pedro decided to stand with them, declaring the country's independence from Portugal on September 7, 1822. A month later, Prince Pedro was declared the first emperor of Brazil, with the royal title of Dom Pedro I, resulting in the founding of the Empire of Brazil. The Brazilian War of Independence, which had already begun along this process, spread through the northern, northeastern regions and in the Cisplatina province. The last Portuguese soldiers surrendered on March 8, 1824. Portugal officially recognized Brazilian independence on August 29, 1825. On April 7, 1831, worn down by years of administrative turmoil and political dissent with both liberal and conservative sides of politics, including an attempt of republican secession and unreconciled to the way that absolutists in Portugal had given in the succession of King John VI, Pedro I departed for Portugal to reclaim his daughter's crown after abdicating the Brazilian throne in favor of his 5-year-old son and heir. As the new emperor could not exert his constitutional powers until he came of age, a regency was set up by the National Assembly. In the absence of a charismatic figure who could represent a moderate face of power, during this period a series of localized rebellions took place, such as the Cabanajum in Gro-Para, the Male Revolt in Salvador, the Baleta, the Sabinata, and the Ragamuffin War, which began in Rio Grande do Sul and was supported by Giuseppe Garibaldi. These emerged from the province's dissatisfaction with the central power, coupled with old and latent social tensions peculiar to a vast, slave-holding, and newly independent nation-state. This period of internal political and social upheaval, which included the Praieira Revolt in Pernambuco, was overcome only at the end of the 1840s, years after the end of the Regency, which occurred with the premature coronation of Pedro II in 1841. During the last phase of the monarchy, internal political debate centered on the issue of slavery. The Atlantic slave trade was abandoned in 1850, as a result of the British Aberdeen Act and the Eusebio de Quiros Law, but only in May 1888, after a long process of internal mobilization and debate for an ethical and legal dismantling of slavery in the country, was the institution formally abolished with the approval of the Golden Law. The foreign affairs policies of the monarchy dealt with issues with the countries of the Southern Cone with whom Brazil had borders. Long after the Cisplatin War that resulted in the independence of Uruguay, Brazil won 3 international wars during the 58-year reign of Pedro II, the Platin War, the Uruguayan War and the devastating Paraguayan War. the largest war effort in Brazilian history. Although there was no desire among the majority of Brazilians to change the country's form of government, on November 15, 1889, in disagreement with the majority of the Imperial Army officers, as well as with rural and financial elites for different reasons, the monarchy was overthrown by a military coup. A few days later, the national flag was replaced with a new design that included the national motto Ordem e Progresso, influenced by positivism. November 15th is now Republic Day, a national holiday. Early Republic. The early Republican government was a military dictatorship, with the army dominating affairs both in Rio de Janeiro and in the States. Freedom of the press disappeared and elections were controlled by those in power. Not until 1894, following an economic crisis and a military one, did civilians take power, remaining there until October 1930. If in relation to its foreign policy, the country in this first Republican period maintained a relative balance characterized by a success in resolving border disputes with neighboring countries, only broken by the Acre War and its involvement in World War I, followed by a failed attempt to exert a prominent role in the League of Nations. Internally, from the crisis of Ensilamento and the Navy revolts, a prolonged cycle of financial, political, and social instability began until the 1920s. Keeping the country besieged by various rebellions, both civilian and military. Little by little, a cycle of general instability sparked by these crises undermined the regime to such an extent that in the wake of the murder of his running mate, the defeated opposition presidential candidate Getulio Vargas, supported by most of the military, successfully led the revolution of 1930. Vargas and the military were supposed to assume power temporarily, but instead closed down Congress, extinguished the Constitution, ruled with emergency powers and replaced the state's governors with his own supporters. In the 1930s, 3 attempts to remove Vargas and his supporters from power failed. The first was the Constitutionalist Revolution in 1932, led by the São Paulo's oligarchy. The second was a communist uprising in November 1935, and the last one a putsch attempt by local fascists in May 1938. The 1935 uprising created a security crisis in which Congress transferred more power to the executive branch. The 1937 coup d'état resulted in the cancellation of the 1938 election and formalized Vargas as dictator, beginning the Estado Novo era. During this period, government brutality and censorship of the press increased. During World War II, Brazil remained neutral until August 1942, when the country suffered retaliation by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in a strategic dispute over the South Atlantic, and, therefore, entered the war on the Allied side. In addition to its participation in the Battle of the Atlantic, Brazil also sent an expeditionary force to fight in the Italian campaign. With the Allied victory in 1945 and the end of the fascist regimes in Europe, Vargas's position became unsustainable, and he was swiftly overthrown in another military coup, with democracy reinstated by the same army that had ended it 15 years earlier. Vargas committed suicide in August 1954 amid a political crisis, after having returned to power by election in 1950. Contemporary era. Several brief interim governments followed Vargas's suicide. Juscelino Kubitschek became president in 1956 and assumed a conciliatory posture towards the political opposition that allowed him to govern without major crises. The economy and industrial sector grew remarkably, but his greatest achievement was the construction of the new capital city of Brasilia, inaugurated in 1960. Kubitschek's successor, Jânio Quadros, resigned in 1961 less than a year after taking office. His vice president, João Goulart, assumed the presidency, but aroused strong political opposition and was deposed in April 1964 by a coup that resulted in a military dictatorship. The new regime was intended to be transitory but gradually closed in on itself and became a full dictatorship with the promulgation of the Fifth Institutional Act in 1968. Oppression was not limited to those who resorted to guerrilla tactics to fight the regime, but also reached institutional opponents, artists, journalists, and other members of civil society, inside and outside the country through the infamous Operation Condor. Like other brutal authoritarian regimes, due to an economic boom, known as the economic miracle, the regime reached a peak in popularity in the early 1970s. Slowly, however, the wear and tear of years of dictatorial power that had not slowed the repression, even after the defeat of the leftist guerrillas. The inability to deal with the economic crises of the period and popular pressure made an opening policy inevitable, which from the regime side was led by Generals Escobedo Geisel and Galbari do Couto e Silva. With the enactment of the amnesty law in 1979, Brazil began a slow return to democracy, which was completed during the 1980s. Civilians returned to power in 1985 when José Sarney assumed the presidency. He became unpopular during his tenure through failure to control the economic crisis and hyperinflation he inherited from the military regime. Sarney's unsuccessful government led to the election in 1989 of the almost unknown Fernando Collor, who was subsequently impeached by the National Congress in 1992. Collor was succeeded by his vice president, Itamar Franco, who appointed Fernando Henrique Cardoso Minister of Finance. In 1994, Cardoso produced a highly successful Plano Real, that, after decades of failed economic plans made by previous governments attempting to curb hyperinflation, finally stabilized the Brazilian economy. Cardoso won the 1994 election, and again in 1998. The peaceful transition of power from Cardoso to his main opposition leader, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, elected in 2002 and re-elected in 2006, was seen as proof that Brazil had achieved a long-sought political stability. However, sparked by indignation and frustrations accumulated over decades from corruption, police brutality, inefficiencies of the political establishment and public service, numerous peaceful protests erupted in Brazil from the middle of first term of Dilma Rousseff, who had succeeded Lula after winning election in 2010 and again in 2014 by narrow margins. Rousseff was impeached by the Brazilian Congress in 2016, halfway into her second term, and replaced by her vice president Michel Temer, who assumed full presidential powers after Rousseff's impeachment was accepted on August 31. Large street protests for and against her took place during the impeachment process. The charges against her were fueled by political and economic crises along with evidence of involvement with politicians from all the primary political parties. In 2017, the Supreme Court requested the investigation of 71 Brazilian lawmakers and 9 ministers of President Michel Temer's cabinet who were allegedly linked to the Petrobras corruption scandal. President Temer himself was also accused of corruption. According to a 2018 poll, 62% of the population said that corruption was Brazil's biggest problem. In the fiercely disputed 2018 elections, the controversial conservative candidate Jair Bolsonaro of the Social Liberal Party was elected president, winning in the second round Fernando Haddad, of the Workers' Party, with the support of 55.13% of the valid votes. In the early 2020s, Brazil became one of the hardest hit countries during the COVID-19 pandemic, receiving the second highest death toll worldwide after the United States. In May 2021, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva stated that he would run for a third term in the 2022 Brazilian general election against Bolsonaro. On October 2022, Lula was in first place in first round, with 49% of the support from the electorate, and received 51% of the votes in the second round. On January 8, 2023, a week after Lula's inauguration, a mob of Bolsonaro's supporters attacked Brazil's federal government buildings in the capital, Brasilia, after several weeks of unrest. Government and politics. The form of government is a democratic federative republic, with a presidential system. The president is both head of state and head of government of the Union and is elected for a 4-year term, with the possibility of re-election for a second successive term. The current president is Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. The president appoints the ministers of state, who assist in government. Legislative houses in each political entity are the main source of law in Brazil. The National Congress is the federation's bicameral legislature, consisting of the Chamber of Deputies and the Federal Senate. Judiciary authorities exercise jurisdictional duties almost exclusively. In 2021, the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index categorized Brazil as a flawed democracy, ranking 46th in the report, and Freedom House classified it as a free country at Freedom in the World report. The political administrative organization of the Federative Republic of Brazil comprises the Union, the states, the federal district, and the municipalities. The Union, the states, the federal district, and the municipalities, are the spheres of government. The federation is set on 5 fundamental principles: sovereignty, citizenship, dignity of human beings, the social values of labor and freedom of enterprise, and political pluralism. The classic tripartite branches of government are formally established by the Constitution. The executive and legislative are organized independently in all 3 spheres of government, while the judiciary is organized only at the federal and state and federal district spheres. All members of the executive and legislative branches are directly elected. For most of its democratic history, Brazil has had a multi-party system, with proportional representation. Voting is compulsory for the literate between 18 and 70 years old and optional for illiterates and those between 16 and 18 or beyond 70. The country has around 30 registered political parties. 20 political parties are represented in Congress. It is common for politicians to switch parties, and thus the proportion of congressional seats held by particular parties changes regularly. Foreign policy. Brazil's international relations are based on Article 4 of the Federal Constitution, which establishes non-intervention, self-determination, international cooperation and the peaceful settlement of conflicts as the guiding principles of Brazil's relationship with other countries and multilateral organizations. According to the Constitution, the President has ultimate authority over foreign policy, while the Congress is tasked with reviewing and considering all diplomatic nominations and international treaties, as well as legislation relating to Brazilian foreign policy. Brazil's foreign policy is a byproduct of the country's position as a regional power in Latin America, a leader among developing countries, and an emerging world power. Brazilian foreign policy has generally been based on the principles of multilateralism, peaceful dispute settlement, and non-intervention in the affairs of other countries. Brazil is a founding member state of the Community of Portuguese-language countries, also known as the Lusophone Commonwealth, an international organization and political association of Lusophone nations. An increasingly well-developed tool of Brazil's foreign policy is providing aid as a donor to other developing countries. Brazil does not just use its growing economic strength to provide financial aid, but it also provides high levels of expertise and, most importantly of all, a quiet non-confrontational diplomacy to improve governance levels. Total aid is estimated to be around 1 billion per year, which includes. In addition, Brazil already managed a peacekeeping mission in Haiti and makes in-kind contributions to the World Food Programme. This is in addition to humanitarian assistance and contributions to multilateral development agencies. The scale of this aid places it on par with China and India. The Brazilian South-South aid has been described as a global model in waiting. Political subdivisions. Brazil is a federation composed of 26 states, 1 federal district, and the 5,570 municipalities. States have autonomous administrations, collect their own taxes and receive a share of taxes collected by the federal government. They have a governor and a unicameral legislative body elected directly by their voters. They also have independent courts of law for common justice. Despite this, states have much less autonomy to create their own laws than in other federal states such as the United States. For example, criminal and civil laws can be voted by only the federal bicameral Congress and are uniform throughout the country. The states and the federal district are grouped into regions: northern, northeast, central west, southeast and southern. The Brazilian regions are merely geographical, not political or administrative divisions, and they do not have any specific form of government. Although defined by law, Brazilian regions serve mainly statistical purposes, and also to define the distribution of federal funds in development projects. Municipalities, as the states, have autonomous administrations, collect their own taxes and receive a share of taxes collected by the federal and state government. Each has an elected mayor and legislative body, but no separate court of law. Indeed, a court of law organized by the state can encompass many municipalities in a single justice administrative division called Comarca. Brazil's constitution also provides for the creation of federal territories, which are administrative divisions directly controlled by the federal government. However, there are currently no federal territories in the country, as the 1988 Constitution abolished the last 3, Amapá and Roraima, which gained statehood status, and Fernando de Noronha, which became a state district of Pernambuco. Economy. Brazil's upper-middle-income mixed-market economy is rich in natural resources. It has the largest national economy in Latin America, the 9th largest economy in the world by nominal GDP, and the 8th largest by PPP. After rapid growth in preceding decades, the country entered an ongoing recession in 2014 amid a political corruption scandal and nationwide protests. A developing country, Brazil has a labor force of roughly 100 million, which is the world's 5th largest, with a high unemployment rate of 14.4% as of 2021. Its foreign exchange reserves are the 10th highest in the world. The B3 in São Paulo is the largest stock exchange of Latin America by market capitalization. In regards to poverty, about 1.9% of the total population lives at 2.15 a day, while about 19% live at 6.85 a day. Brazil's economy suffers from endemic corruption and high income inequality. The Brazilian real is the national currency. Brazil's diversified economy includes agriculture, industry, and a wide range of services. The large service sector accounts for about 72.7% of total GDP, followed by the industrial sector, while the agriculture sector is by far the smallest, making up 6.6% of total GDP. Brazil is one of the largest producers of various agricultural commodities, and also has a large cooperative sector that provides 50% of the food in the country. It has been the world's largest producer of coffee for the last 150 years. Brazil is the world's largest producer of sugarcane, soy, coffee, and orange, is one of the top 5 producers of maize, cotton, lemon, tobacco, pineapple, banana, beans, coconut, watermelon, and papaya, and is one of the top 10 world producers of cocoa, cashew, mango, rice, tomato, sorghum, tangerine, avocado, persimmon, and guava, among others. Regarding livestock, it is one of the 5 largest producers of chicken meat, beef, pork, and cow's milk in the world. In the mining sector, Brazil is among the largest producers of iron ore, copper, gold, bauxite, manganese, tin, niobium, and nickel. In terms of precious stones, Brazil is the world's largest producer of amethyst, topaz, agate, and one of the main producers of tourmaline, emerald, aquamarine, garnet and opal. The country is a major exporter of soy, iron ore, pulp, maize, beef, chicken meat, soybean meal, sugar, coffee, tobacco, cotton, orange juice, footwear, airplanes, cars, vehicle parts, gold, ethanol, semi-finished iron, among other products. Brazil is the world's 24th largest exporter and 26th largest importer as of 2021. China is its largest trading partner, accounting for 32% of the total trade. Other large trading partners include the United States, Argentina, the Netherlands, and Canada. Its automotive industry is the 8th largest in the world. In the food industry, Brazil was the 2nd largest exporter of processed foods in the world in 2019. The country was the 2nd largest producer of pulp in the world and the 8th largest producer of paper in 2016. In the footwear industry, Brazil was the 4th largest producer in 2019. It was also the 9th largest producer of steel in the world. In 2018, the chemical industry of Brazil was the 8th largest in the world. Although it was among the 5 largest world producers in 2013, Brazil's textile industry is very little integrated into world trade. The tertiary sector represented 75.8% of the country's GDP in 2018, according to the IBGE. The service sector was responsible for 60% of GDP and trade for 13%. It covers a wide range of activities: commerce, accommodation and catering, transport, communications, financial services, real estate activities and services provided to businesses, public administration, and other services such as education, social and health services, research and development, sports activities, etc., since it consists of activities complementary to other sectors. Micro and small businesses represent 30% of the country's GDP. In the commercial sector, for example, they represent 53% of the GDP within the activities of the sector. Tourism. Tourism in Brazil is a growing sector and key to the economy of several regions of the country. The country had 6.36 million visitors in 2015, ranking in terms of the international tourist arrivals as the main destination in South America and second in Latin America after Mexico. Revenues from international tourists reached US $6 billion in 2010, showing a recovery from the 2008 to 2009 economic crisis. Historical records of 5.4 million visitors and US $6.8 billion in receipts were reached in 2011. In the list of world tourist destinations, in 2018, Brazil was the 48th most visited country, with 6.6 million tourists and revenues of $5.9 billion. Natural areas are its most popular tourism product, a combination of ecotourism with leisure and recreation, mainly sun and beach, and adventure travel, as well as cultural tourism. Among the most popular destinations are the Amazon rainforest, beaches, and dunes in the northeast region, the Pantanal in the center-west region, beaches at Rio de Janeiro and Santa Catarina, cultural tourism in Minas Gerais and business trips to São Paulo. In terms of the 2015 Travel and Tourism Competitiveness Index, which is a measurement of the factors that make it attractive to develop business in the travel and tourism industry of individual countries, Brazil ranked in the 28th place at the world's level, third in the Americas, after Canada and United States. Domestic tourism is a key market segment for the tourism industry in Brazil. In 2005, 51 million Brazilian nationals made 10 times more trips than foreign tourists and spent 5 times more money than their international counterparts. The main destination states in 2005 were São Paulo, Minas Gerais, Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, and Santa Catarina. The top 3 states by trip origin were São Paulo, Minas Gerais. In terms of tourism revenues, the top earners by state were São Paulo and Bahia. For 2005, the 3 main trip purposes were visiting friends and family, sun and beach, and cultural tourism. Transportation. Brazilian roads are the primary carriers of freight and passenger traffic. The road system totaled 1,720,000 kilometers in 2019. The total of paved roads increased from 35,496 kilometers in 1967 to 215,000 kilometers in 2018. Brazil's railway system has been declining since 1945, when emphasis shifted to highway construction. The country's total railway track length was 30,576 kilometers in 2015, as compared with 31,848 kilometers in 1970, making it the 9th largest network in the world. Most of the railway system belonged to the Federal Railroad Network Corporation, which was privatized in 2007. The São Paulo Metro began operating on September 14, 1974 as the first underground transit system in Brazil. There are about 2,500 airports in Brazil, including landing fields, the second largest number in the world, after the United States. São Paulo, Guarulhos International Airport, near São Paulo, is the largest and busiest airport with nearly 20 million passengers annually, while handling the vast majority of commercial traffic for the country. For freight transport, waterways are of importance, e.g. the industrial zones of Manaus can be reached only by means of the Solimões, Amazonas waterway. The country also has 50,000 kilometers of waterways. Coastal shipping links widely separated parts of the country. Bolivia and Paraguay have been given free ports at Santos. Of the 36 deep water ports, Santos, Itajaí, Rio Grande, Paranagua, Rio de Janeiro, Sepetiba, Vitória, Suape, Manaus, and São Francisco do Sul are the most important. Bulk carriers have to wait up to 18 days before being serviced, container ships 36.3 hours on average. Race and ethnicity. According to the National Research by Household Sample of 2022, 45.3% of the population described themselves as mixed, officially called brown or pardo, 43.5% as white, 10.2% as black, 0.6% as indigenous and 0.4% as East Asian, officially called yellow or amarilla. Since the arrival of the Portuguese in 1500, considerable genetic mixing between Amerindians, Europeans, and Africans has taken place in all regions of the country, European ancestry being dominant nationwide according to the vast majority of all autosomal studies undertaken covering the entire population, accounting for between 65% and 77%, while the African ancestry among the Brazilians are estimated that 14.3% to 25% and more than 80% of Brazilians have over 10% African ancestry, and the indigenous ancestry is significant and present in all regions of Brazil. People of considerable Amerindian ancestry form the majority of the population in the northern, northeastern, and center-western regions. In 2007, the National Indian Foundation estimated that Brazil has 67 different uncontacted tribes, up from their estimate of 40 in 2005. Brazil is believed to have the largest number of uncontacted peoples in the world. Religion. Christianity is the country's predominant faith, with Roman Catholicism being its largest denomination. Brazil has the world's largest Catholic population. According to the 2010 demographic census, 64.63% of the population followed Roman Catholicism, 22.2% Protestantism, 2% Kardecist Spiritism, 3.2% other religions, undeclared or undetermined, while 8% had no religion. Religion in Brazil was formed from the meeting of the Catholic Church with the religious traditions of enslaved African peoples and indigenous peoples. This confluence of faiths during the Portuguese colonization of Brazil led to the development of a diverse array of syncretistic practices within the overarching umbrella of Brazilian Catholic Church, characterized by traditional Portuguese festivities. Religious pluralism increased during the 20th century, and the Protestant community has grown to include over 22% of the population. The most common Protestant denominations are evangelical Pentecostal ones. Other Protestant branches with a notable presence in the country include the Baptists, Seventh-day Adventists, Lutherans, and the Reformed tradition. In recent decades, Protestantism, particularly in forms of Pentecostalism and evangelicalism, has spread in Brazil, while the proportion of Catholics has dropped significantly. After Protestantism, individuals professing no religion are also a significant group, exceeding 8% of the population as of the 2010 census. The cities of Boa Vista, Salvador, and Porto Velho have the greatest proportion of irreligious residents in Brazil. Teresina, Fortaleza, and Florianopolis were the most Roman Catholic in the country. Greater Rio de Janeiro, not including the city proper, is the most irreligious and least Roman Catholic Brazilian periphery, while Greater Porto Alegre and Greater Fortaleza are on the opposite sides of the lists, respectively. In October 2009, the Brazilian Senate approved and enacted by the President of Brazil in February 2010, an agreement with the Vatican, in which the legal statute of the Catholic Church in Brazil is recognized. Health. The Brazilian public health system, the unified health system, is managed and provided by all levels of government, being the largest system of this type in the world. On the other hand, private healthcare systems play a complementary role. Public health services are universal and offered to all citizens of the country for free. However, the construction and maintenance of health centers and hospitals are financed by taxes, and the country spends about 9% of its GDP on expenditures in the area. In 2012, Brazil had 1.85 doctors and 2.3 hospital beds for every 1,000 inhabitants. Despite all the progress made since the creation of the universal healthcare system in 1988, there are still several public health problems in Brazil. In 2006, the main points to be solved were the high infant and maternal mortality rates. The number of deaths from non-communicable diseases, such as cardiovascular diseases and cancer, also has a considerable impact on the health of the Brazilian population. Finally, external but preventable factors such as car accidents, violence, and suicide caused 14.9% of all deaths in the country. The Brazilian health system was ranked 125th among the 191 countries evaluated by the World Health Organization in 2000. Language. The official language of Brazil is Portuguese, which almost all of the population speaks and is virtually the only language used in newspapers, radio, television, and for business and administrative purposes. Brazil is the only Portuguese-speaking nation in the Americas, making the language an important part of Brazilian national identity and giving it a national culture distinct from those of its Spanish-speaking neighbors. Brazilian Portuguese has had its own development, mostly similar to 16th-century Central and Southern dialects of European Portuguese with a few influences from the Amerindian and African languages, especially West African and Bantu restricted to the vocabulary only. As a result, the language is somewhat different, mostly in phonology, from the language of Portugal and other Portuguese-speaking countries. These differences are comparable to those between American and British English. The 2002 Sign Language Law requires government authorities and public agencies to accept and provide information in Língua Brasileira dos Sinais or Libras, the Brazilian Sign Language, while a 2005 presidential edict extends this to require teaching of the language as a part of the education and speech and language pathology curricula. Libras teachers, instructors, and translators are recognized professionals. Schools and health services must provide access to deaf people. Minority languages are spoken throughout the nation. 180 Amerindian languages are spoken in remote areas and a significant number of other languages are spoken by immigrants and their descendants. In the municipality of São Gabriel de Cachoeira, Nhingatu, Banawa, and Tucano languages had been granted co-official status with Portuguese. There are significant communities of German and Italian origins in the southern and southeastern regions, whose ancestors' native languages were carried along to Brazil, and which, still alive there, are influenced by the Portuguese language. Italian is officially a historic patrimony of Rio Grande do Sul, and two German dialects possess co-official status in a few municipalities. Italian is also recognized as ethnic language in the Santa Teresa microregion and Vila Velha, and is taught as mandatory second language at school. Culture. The core culture of Brazil is derived from Portuguese culture, because of its strong colonial ties with the Portuguese Empire. Among other influences, the Portuguese introduced the Portuguese language, Roman Catholicism, and colonial architectural styles. The culture was also strongly influenced by African, indigenous, and non-Portuguese European cultures and traditions. Some aspects of Brazilian culture were influenced by the contributions of Italian, German, and other European as well as Japanese, Jewish and Arab immigrants who arrived in large numbers in the south and southeast of Brazil during the 19th and 20th centuries. The indigenous Amerindians influenced Brazil's language and cuisine, and the Africans influenced language, cuisine, music, dance, and religion. Brazilian art has developed since the 16th century into different styles that range from Baroque to Romanticism, Modernism, Expressionism, Cubism, Surrealism, and Abstractionism. Brazilian cinema dates back to the birth of the medium in the late 19th century and has gained a new level of international acclaim since the 1960s. Music. The music of Brazil was formed mainly from the fusion of European, native indigenous, and African elements. Until the 19th century, Portugal was the gateway to most of the influences that built Brazilian music, although many of these elements were not of Portuguese origin, but generally European. The first was José Mauricio Nunes Garcia, author of sacred pieces with influence of Viennese classicism. The major contribution of the African element was the rhythmic diversity and some dances and instruments that had a bigger role in the development of popular music and folk, flourishing especially in the 20th century. Popular music since the late 18th century began to show signs of forming a characteristically Brazilian sound, with samba considered the most typical and on the UNESCO Cultural Heritage List. Maracatu and a fox are two music traditions that have been popularized by their appearance in the annual Brazilian carnivals. Capoeira is usually played with its own music referred to as capoeira music, which is usually considered to be a call and response type of folk music. Forró is a type of folk music prominent during the Festa Junina in northeastern Brazil. Jack A. Draper III, a professor of Portuguese at the University of Missouri, argues that forró was used as a way to subdue feelings of nostalgia for a rural lifestyle. Coro is a very popular music instrumental style. Its origins are in 19th century Rio de Janeiro. In spite of the name, the style often has a fast and happy rhythm, characterized by virtuosity, improvisation, subtle modulations and full of syncopation and counterpoint. Bossa Nova is also a well-known style of Brazilian music developed and popularized in the 1950s and 1960s. The phrase Bossa Nova means literally new trend. A lyrical fusion of samba and jazz, Bossa Nova acquired a large following starting in the 1960s. Literature. Brazilian literature dates back to the 16th century, to the writings of the first Portuguese explorers in Brazil, such as Pero Vaz de Caminha, filled with descriptions of fauna, flora, and commentary about the indigenous population that fascinated European readers. Brazil produced significant works in Romanticism. Novelists like Joaquim Manuel de Macedo and José de Alencar wrote novels about love and pain. Alencar, in his long career, also treated indigenous people as heroes in the indigenous novels O Guarani, Iracema, and Ubarujara. Machado de Assis, one of his contemporaries, wrote in virtually all genres and continues to gain international prestige from critics worldwide. Brazilian modernism, evidenced by the Modern Art Week in 1922, was concerned with a nationalist avant-garde literature, while postmodernism brought a generation of distinct poets like João Cabral de Melo Neto, Carlos Drummond de Andrade, Vinícius de Moraes, Cora Coralina, Graciliano Ramos, Cecilia Meirelles, and internationally known writers dealing with universal and regional subjects like Jorge Amado, João Guimarães Rosa, Clarice Lispector, and Manuel Bandeira. Brazil's most significant literary award is the Camões Prize, which it shares with the rest of the Portuguese-speaking world. As of 2016, Brazil has 11 recipients of the prize. Brazil also holds its own literary academy, the Brazilian Academy of Letters, a non-profit cultural organization pointed in perpetuating the care of the national language and literature.